Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for the Oxford Real Farming Conference for hosting this session. This session is about California farming resilience in the face of climate disaster. My name is Anthony Chang, calling in from California, and have the honor of helping moderate this conversation along with several other colleagues that I know through the Castanea Fellowship, Rowen White, from the Native American Food Sovereignty Alliance, Kelly Carlisle from Acta Non Verba, and Leonard Diggs from Pie Ranch. They'll introduce themselves in a couple minutes, and then we'll have a free-flowing conversation among Kelly, Leonard, and Rowen for the next hour or so. Before we get started, just wanted to share a couple things. Again, as many of you who have signed up for this probably know, it's about California farming resilience in the face of climate disaster. Fires are now a staple of summer in California, which is also during one of the most important growing cycles. As California endures this new climate pattern, farmers are facing the reality of burnt land, seedlings, and precious harvest lost. What can be done? What is being done? What might others learn? This session is about hearing the perspectives of Black and Indigenous leaders in California who are embodying resilience in the face of these acute challenges. Also want to express some gratitude for the Castanea Fellowship, who have been supporting all of us and a couple other dozen leaders, food systems leaders in North America, fighting for just and resilient food economies. And also want to share that we wanted to focus this to be a conversation, and hopefully you all can kind of listen in to this conversation and invite you all to listen deeply, kind of minimize kind of all of the chatter on chat. And we might not get to many of the questions that you all might uplift in the chat, but if there are questions that kind of flow into the conversation that we're hoping to have today, then we might try to get to a couple of those. So without any further ado, I'm going to invite Rowen and then Kelly and then Leonard to do a quick, couple-minute intro of yourselves and your work, and then after that, then we'll get into the conversation.
Great. Sego Seguego, Ganyat Dahawa Yungyats. Greetings, everyone. My name is Rowen White. My Mohawk name is Ganyat Dahawe, which is how I introduced myself in my native language, and that means she who carries the snow. I'm originally from a small Mohawk community right on the New York-Canadian border. An international border runs right through our reserve, but I currently reside in Northern California. In the Sierra Foothills on a 10-acre family farm. I am the program director of the Native American Food Sovereignty Alliance. I work heavily in mentorship, education around anything from indigenous seed keeping to food and culinary and traditions and cultural memory. I'm a farmer and a seed keeper. I'm a mother. And I'm very honored to carry a bundle of ancestral seeds from my indigenous people and ancestors. And we also have our educational farm here, Sierra Seeds, which is really focused on growing the next generation of seed stewards in our bioregion. So we focus on seed stewardship. We have several hundred varieties in a native seed bank here on the land, and take a very indigenous approach to keeping those seeds alive. And so I'm just so thrilled to be here with my Castanea fellows here on this panel to talk into some of the pressing issues of these transformative times. So looking forward to a good conversation. I'll hand it over to Kelly.
Thanks so much, Rowen. Thank you all for having me here. My name is Kelly Carlisle. I am the founder and executive director of Acta Non Verba Youth Urban Farm Project, located in East Oakland, California. We work with youth age 5 to 17 now on 3 farms in the city of Oakland. The kids plant, harvest, and sell the produce that we grow. 100% of those dollars are placed into individual savings accounts for them that can only be used for educational purposes. I am honored to be here with fellow Castanea fellows. And again, thank you. I'll pass it to Leonard.
Hello, everyone. I'm Leonard Diggs. and I'm a farmer and farm trainer and educator for over 35 years. I'm currently at Pie Ranch, where I'm the director of operations and directing a Cascade Regenerator program for Pie Ranch. We're currently on the lands that were occupied by the Amamutsin tribe, and we have a relationship, a long-going collaboration with them, our organization does, and we're sponsoring a seed growing project here on this property to be able to help them regenerate some of the native grass seeds that were their traditional food crops and part of their traditional foodways. So it's a pleasure to be here with you and to be able to have this conversation.
Great. Thank you so much, Rowen and Kelly and Leonard. Before we get into the weeds of talking about climate chaos and fires and resilience, grounded in your places and experience in California, do any of you want to share any context or more general framework for how you are entering into this conversation?
I think as we get into the conversation, I'm excited to talk into a lot of, the crux of these transformative times is where we're at, and the way in which we can center Black, Indigenous, and bodies of culture in leadership positions. And that's why I'm so thrilled to have such ancestral brilliance here on display and in a conversation in this circle. I would like to acknowledge that I think many of my colleagues here, come from a similar place, but really centering the importance of relationship, the relational foodscapes and foodways, the ways in which we begin to learn how to unhook ourselves as a larger culture from the toxic individualism and the ways in which just the Anthropocene, the way in which humans have been so centered. So really excited to hear from my colleagues around this, what we call kin-centric, management, the ways in which we're decentering humans, but into a larger understanding of how we can belong and be of a place in a way that is not destructive. How can we create economies of abundance as opposed to scarcity and exploitation and extraction? And I think, what we're seeing right now in these times is we're seeing the horrific consequences of people living out of alignment for a long time. And I think there's a big arrogance in thinking that we can live on this land in California or wherever we are without understanding and honoring the original agreements of the cultures and people who originally inhabited those places. And so I'm excited to engage in a conversation that really centers the ancestral brilliance of the diversity of panelists here, and curious to see what we can talk into.
Kelly or Leonard, kind of in some of the prep for this conversation, there were some pieces around, as building off of what Rowen said, Indigenous wisdom, work that's led by communities of color, versus kind of like the capitalism, commodification of land, colonization, systemic racism. I'm curious for either of you, Kelly or Leonard, if there's anything you want to add onto what Rowen shared before we kind of really dive into the meat of the conversation.
Sure. I think this issue of collaboration, cooperation is the key piece. And we have set up a system, as I like to describe it, as this arm's length transaction, as opposed to an arm-in-arm transaction. And even just these transactional terms come in conflict with so much of what we're doing. And specifically, when we see the crisis that we've been exposed to, with COVID and the fires, we're farming here on the coast. Home Pie and Cascade Ranch are, if we could throw far enough, if we had major league arms, we could probably throw balls to the ocean sometimes. But we are so close to the ocean, and yet the fires came down to us. And that's a telling sign in regards to where we are climatically, where we are environmentally. So the efforts that we are going to have to put forward are the efforts that we need to put forward together. It isn't something that, as traditional farmers, can often be out doing their lone thing by themselves on their lone property. It's time for us to come together and work together and be much more inclusive about the diversity of people who are part of that solution.
Absolutely.
And I think that for me, working with youth that are so young and in a community where so many families are just struggling to survive, you know, day to day, get to work, get home, feed my kids, you know, that kind of lifestyle. I'm excited to learn from you all ways to teach our kids to go from just surviving to seeing the bigger picture, right? From what I can have and hold and take and eat and keep right now to what we need to do to look towards the future. When, you know, so much has happened in the last year, but really like the last 6 months that like I put fire season out of my mind, you know, and just started thinking about that in preparation for this conversation about how, you know, I've always grown up hearing fire season, right? So a season, you know, as growers, we know, you know, like there's a season for things, right? It's tomato season, it's green season, whatever it is. And so just thinking about the idea that I've grown up thinking that, you know, this is a naturally occurring event, you know, it's fire season, just like it's any other kind of season. But then, you know, since the skies turned red over the Bay Area and there was no sun for that whole day, you know, it occurred to me that it's all been set up this way, right? Like from genocide of indigenous folks, from taking away cultural ways, all of the ways that white supremacy has set us up for this moment, for there to be no sun in the sky, for there to be, you know, all this unrest happening in the country, you know, like it's all been set up so that, you know, those of us that are just trying to survive the day to day can't see that there are bigger things involved.
Yeah, absolutely.
Did you want to add more, Rowen?
I think go into the next one, and I have a lot to say there. Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, I appreciate all of you kind of like helping kind of set this container around ancestral knowledge and collaboration and kind of the survival while also trying to build what, you know, collectively we need. Also, sorry to just like do context after context. We'll get into the meat of it, but you know, the audience for the conference is global, and so also wanted to set some context on for those of on this call who may not be as familiar with California and the specific context of all of your work in your places. Can you share a little bit about what feels important to name about your place and the work that you all do in California?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would like to speak. I think most folks around the globe saw the horrific images of the West burning in not just California, but, you know, all of the West just completely on fire, record-breaking, you know, seasons. And what we have to say is that I think sometimes people will just sort of blindly throw that into the pile of just climate chaos instead of really reflecting and looking at what is the underlying syndrome that's underneath that, right? Like this is all just symptoms of a greater dis-ease that's happening. And the reason why California and the larger West is facing such ecological catastrophe of this size and scale and proportion is not just 100+ years of fire suppression. You know, there's been fire suppression that have happened, you know, Smokey the Bear and all of the ways in which, you know, the cultural burning of the times has been, you know, negated. And it's not just climate change, but unfortunately, this is an outgrowth of horrifying, you know, horrific genocide, settler colonization, which has, to say it bluntly, has slaughtered the first peoples of California and the people who were the original stewards who upheld the original agreements of this land, right? And severed these time-honored agreements to work together with like the plants, the humans, the land, the minerals, to create what many of us call, and my mentor Martin Prechtel calls cultural sanity again, that we could envision, that cultural sanity. And I think in some ways, in California, we talk a lot about fire-wise communities and coming together and ways in which we're going to solve this problem, the fire crisis problem. And I think if we don't focus on the deeper enduring solutions to this current problem, which means that how are we as inhabitants of this land going to have an understanding of how to be of place, of how to have a cosmology which understands healthy relationships that are interdependent, we need to get to that place. And if we can't reckon first with the horrors that took the original stewards and inhabitants of this land away, and we can't make the relational reparations needed to, help some of those living descendants. There are living descendants of Indigenous peoples who hold the knowledge of how to steward this land in a way that isn't destructive. And so if we're not centering those voices, that's what I'm always advocating for, is that, we're going to be in no better place unless we can cultivate this, a culture of peoples that can understand that fire is destructive, but it's also healing and medicine for the land, and fire has a place in the ecology here, and so until we can invite that wisdom back in and not only just tokenize the Indigenous peoples here, but actually uplift them and put them into places of leadership where they're being able to get land back and restore their relationship, repair and restore those relationships to the land. And we're just going to concede, this is going to be on repeat for the continual future. And so that I just get really passionate about that, because I'm Indigenous, but I'm not Indigenous to California, but I call this place home. And so how can we continue to have reciprocity to the ancestors of this land, and really center their voices and center their needs to resource themselves to begin to remember that cultural sanity that could exist here in California. I don't know if Leonard or Kelly want to riff off that, or.
Yeah, there's a lot to say about that. The first thing that comes up for me is the difference between tools and techniques and values. We oftentimes try to center the tools and the techniques and the trends of the time on what to do with fire, but we don't speak as much to the core issues of if we don't have the key values of who gets included, who gets to have a say, as you were just referring to, Rowen, and that sharing the stage, sharing the voices, sharing the power becomes the essential piece, because we've had the tools, we've had the techniques forever, but we haven't had a set of principles and values that allowed them to be put into place. There's a lot of symbolism with the fire. I think of slow burn, fast burn. We know that a lot of indigenous ways used fire in a slow burn way. Whereas when we see these fire disasters that we've seen over the last, 15 years at least, probably, there are these fast burns. I've been in California my whole life, and I've been fortunate enough to move around and farm in different places in California. And I saw the fires in Lake County. I saw the fires in Sonoma County. I've seen the fires here along the Central Coast. And it's amazing to see the fires chase us wherever we go. And it also just to see the different aspects of that. Why are we moving into the wildlands? Why are we encroaching constantly on nature in ways that puts us in danger? And also in seeing those three counties, seeing the responses that happen on a human scale. Lake County is a poor county, and they're still trying to recover from the first fires they had. Where when I saw Sonoma County get on fire, and it's the wine country, there's a lot of prestige, people from all over the Bay Area were jumping in and wanting to support Lake County to get back on its feet, while Lake County was still suffering. So here again, we still have this class issue, and who gets supported and who doesn't get supported. And at every edge that we look at, those are some of the issues that pop up, and that are represented in the efforts that we need to make.
Yeah.
One of the things that's striking me about this group is, like, Rowen, I know that kind of your place is up in the Sierra Mountains, and Leonard, as you mentioned, kind of like paint that picture of like you're on the coast, right? Like on the ocean. And Kelly, you're in a very urban place in Oakland, and wondering if you could talk about kind of the work that you do and how the context of being in an urban place kind of factors into this conversation.
Sure. I think that when these fires happen in the communities that we serve, or when the fires happen in California and the smoke blows into Oakland, East Oakland in particular, which is already one of the hotspots for asthma, already has air quality issues. We're between two major freeways. We have a crematorium, a few blocks down. We have, a box company that's caught on fire a couple times now. So when these fires happen and the smoke comes into East Oakland, it's just another disaster for our community to deal with, right? It's just another thing, another reason to hate where they live, right? To not feel valued, to not feel like, nobody's swooping in here and taking us to Tahoe, for example. You know what I mean? Like, nobody's coming here to, get buses of us so that we can all go to where the air is fresh again, right? We had some wonderful community organizations that not only gave out masks, but then, because it's just another thing. Like, if the streets don't kill you, the air will, right? If COVID doesn't kill you, then the air will, and then the streets will, you know what I mean? So it's like one more vector for death and disenfranchisement. So these community organizations came in and not only gave people masks, but forced them to wear them, right then and there, like, don't you see this, But I think that in our community, it's already so overwhelmed, we're already so overwhelmed with all the, I started this organization because, at the time, the term food desert was a thing, right? So we were working in a food desert. We, we're providing, outdoor education plus nutrition classes plus food, like, it was all very altruistic. And then the longer we were in the community, the more it made sense. The phrase food apartheid started to make sense. And I just, the more I'm in this work, the more I'm with folks like you all, the more I learn. It wasn't until this past year when the fires were happening, and Trevor Noah had to explain to me, from the Daily Show, what cultural burnings were, and that, because, again, of white supremacy, that practice was stopped. And this is one reason why these fires are so enormous and horrible, right? Like, what Rowen is saying, what Leonard is saying, are things that need to be broken down from kindergarten up, right? These are things that I shouldn't be 41 just understanding that Indigenous folks had a way to make it so that this wasn't, that I can't tell you how much Nazi in the sun bothered me that day, but, like, it was intense, and I really had held it together. If I had known that cultural burnings were a thing, in my teen years, in my 20s, I might have been able to see, figure out some way to influence policy or figure out, I mean, not to say that it's too late now, but all I'm saying is it's very late in the game once the smoke blots out the sun to learn that there was a way for this to not be. Sorry, I get very passionate about this, about the stuff I don't know, and like that I should have known, and that I'm just going to say this last thing. Like, one thing that the last 4 years has taught me is that there really is no depth to the ways that white supremacy has set up humanity for failure. There really is, from sea to frickin' shining sea, from India to, everywhere, that white supremacy has set humanity on the precipice of kaboom within generations, and it is sick, sad, and wrong. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, I mean, but to riff off of that, fire is like one of the most destructive forces, as we saw, but it's also like we've worked here on our land with reintroducing fire into the ecology as a friend and not a foe, like in the cultural burning. And so it can also be incredibly life-giving and healing. Like if you've run a burn on the land and then you see the land afterwards, like when it's not at this catastrophic level, it's actually incredibly beautiful. And a lot of plants endemic to California thrive off of fire. They're fed by fire. They're nourished by fire. And I think if we look at by nature, humans can be, on one hand, some of the most destructive beings to ever have landed on the earth, but then on the other hand, we have this incredible capacity to make beauty and to contribute in such life-giving ways with our hands and our voices, and to tend relationships in that way. And so I think my prayer in all of this, like through seeing this, is that we're living through burning times. We're seeing a lot of things, not only actually physically burning, but we're reckoning with a mindset and a spiritual virus that has really taken over the globe in the form of capitalism and an extractive industry, that I think from an Indigenous woman who can hear very clearly the voices of my ancestors echo through my blood and my bones, I invite you all to link up to those ancestors of yours that are Indigenous to somewhere and tend the possibility that we can become people again who understand those relationships, who can live in a world where fire is friend and not foe, where we can understand that cosmology that tells us and encodes that way of living seasonally on the land. Like we can tend that possibility, and that is our embodied prayer as farmers and seed keepers and teachers and mentors. And so I just want to keep that possibility of hope alive, because, but again, it's not to bypass, it's not to, because, on the path of reconciliation, on the path of reparations, the first step is truth telling. We got to look this in the eye, and we have to really understand where we're at. And if we can't see that capitalism and settler colonialism is the foundation syndrome, and just the cultural disconnect, the ways in which diaspora has just, I look at it and I see a lot of brokenhearted people who have so much grief in their heart, they don't even know how to live on the land anymore. And so they just keep acting in ways that are incredibly destructive, and the way that ends up compounding into the climate chaos that we see. And I think I can't underscore enough. I mean, I also, Kelly, didn't realize that, something like Smokey the Bear, who we all saw, and it was like, forest fires, stop forest fires. Like that was actually doing incredible damage to the legacy of cultural burning in California, and all of us saw him as like a hero, but that's what it was, campaigns like that led to 100+ years of fire suppression, which is what's creating the absolute catastrophe that we're seeing now. And so the question that I have, I think, in all of this is, can this form of cultural burning and concentric land stewardship exist within the colonial construct of individual land proprietorship? Like what does our, because we're looking in our neighborhood here of all these, little postage stamps of farms, individually owned farms. And we're recognizing that in order for us to invite the landscape back into balance, we're going to have to work together. And it's stitching those broken apart parcels back together and seeing the landscape in such a bigger fire shed, I guess is how you could say it. So, how do we have to look at land proprietorship and its contribution to this? And then also, looking at a campaign like Smokey the Bear, like what does a campaign to increase literacy on cultural burning and Indigenous land stewardship look like? Like, with the youth, like how are we creating creative and innovative campaigns to bring that knowledge back, to resource Indigenous peoples with that knowledge? Those are the questions that I have.
Thanks so much for bringing those questions in, Rowen. Leonard, Kelly, I'm curious if you kind of what comes up for you in those questions.
Yeah,
So many things. Oh, please, please, Leonard, go ahead.
Yeah, please jump in too. I was thinking about the eucalyptus, which a lot of eucalyptus, which are non-native trees, caught fire in this area. And also looking at the path of the fire in other places where I've been, the fires that raged 3 or 4 years ago had raged through 50 years ago. And are, a lot of what you're talking about, Rowen, I like to talk about from the standpoint of robber barons and people who just came in and stole and abused everything that they ran into. They took the resources and they abused the people that they ran into. So robber barons are at the heart of a lot of that, but there's a lot of ignorance too. And many of us, have pieces of knowledge, and then many of us don't have other pieces of knowledge. Kelly, you're referring to it. Rowen, you're referring to it. I could easily refer to my ignorances. And together we stitch together communal knowledge. We can't individually have enough information. We have to stitch it together. And we have to be willing to respond to what we see. I mean, I agree. The fire has been pretty amazing in terms of what it cleaned up on our property. Places that we hadn't seen for years, we were able to see again, and it cleared a path. But what will we do now? Will we get on it? Will we stay on it? There's a lot of effort associated with that. There's a lot of work associated with that. And our capitalistic system doesn't reward that kind of work. And it doesn't reward the type of support that our neighbors might provide us and we might provide them in trying to keep the communal effort going to clean up our properties and to make them more fire responsive and fire resilient. And I think also just the small land holdings that are in urban climates like where you are, Kelly, it's everything seems scaled to its location. We have 418 acres. And in California, 418 acres is a medium-sized farm. And people who have small land holdings would think, wow, that's a lot of land. But when you put a bunch of those 400, 500, 600 acre farms together, they're all like small neighbors cobbled together in towns. We end up in these disintegrated, unconnected relationships, and there's the heart of our problems quite frequently.
Kelly, do you want to get some?
No, I started thinking about. I just started thinking about small communities and versus urban areas, and the romanticization of living in in small communities, right? In small farming communities, like you go over and ask Marge for some sugar and Bob comes over and borrows your rake, like those kind of things. It seems very delicious to those of us that live in the city, right? Like the idea that, there's not hella people around all the time. There's this idea that people are neighborly, right? Whereas, where I live during the pandemic, I didn't realize that my patio was like open to the world. So one day the neighbors who I'd never spoken to looked up and said, "Hi there." And I was like, oh, like they were in my bedroom, We pretend that our four walls, make us and our own kind of nation, right? But I'm thinking about how it looks in small communities versus how community working together, working to address these big issues, how they look different in both areas, right? Like maybe if I lived in, on a farm in Fresno somewhere, I would be neighborly with folks in the farming community that I'm in. And we could have a conversation like what Rowen is talking about, like, did you know that if you, did these burns, that the native grasses will come back, which will ultimately hold the soil in better, and so on and so forth, right? So but here in the city, it's very difficult to even did you know that tomatoes have lycopene? You know what I mean? It's very hard to try to have that same kind of exchange, right? Well, and I want to say the imagined exchange. I've never lived in the country. I don't know what that would look like, but it's very, it seems like it would be very different.
Well, and I think you bring up a really interesting point, Kelly, which is that so much of this is relational, and it depends on us creating spaces for conversations between the different regions and the different, types of community that exist in California. So, for instance, like in the foothills, we have a big responsibility to engage in sane land management practices, indigenous land management practices, recognizing that, when the hills burn up here in toxic and catastrophic ways, all of that smoke is getting funneled down to our brothers and sisters in urban areas, and that has an impact, right? Or, you think about waterways and the ways in which, things, flow downhill. And so I think in some ways, that's why I think the call to creating campaigns that create a new literacy and a new narrative for what it means to be of place and live on a land, it doesn't exclude urban people. In fact, we have to be inclusive to have that narrative and that literacy be a part of things, because and that's where my I think enthusiasm for all this is thinking about all the young people who are so good at telling stories, like compelling stories, funny stories, like the ways in which we can, work with these generations who are coming down, who know how to restory things and to create beautiful narratives, and how can we utilize their brilliance in creating conversations that bring literacy and visibility to some of these old ways that need to be made new again, right? We know we can't go back to the way it was. We have a lot more people, a lot more cultures, a lot more, confluences here now, but how can we bring old ways into a new form? And how can we create campaigns of literacy that get folks in Oakland to understand that they're intimately connected to the health of the forest and the Sierra foothills, right? And that, that there's this like full, and so, I think a lot about it. I think about the ways in which the ways in which social media platforms can, and the youth can begin to create these conversations, these literacy campaigns in new ways, in healthy ways. Yeah.
Rowen, I think that's really powerful, and that puts you all a little bit on the spot. I'm curious if there are examples of that restoring by young people that you all see in your work. I'm not sure if they're like right at the tip of your tongue, but I want to try to like bring the kind of the important kind of concepts and theories into like kind of like small examples of practice that we might see in our communities here in California.
We have an emerging farmers program, so we see 20-somethings quite frequently. And we also have youth programs, so we see elementary and high school students. And we're starting a program where some high school students are going to come and participate in all levels of our organization, where they'll come to any meeting that we happen to be involved in, both at leadership and operational levels, so that they get a sense and the knowledge development of how organizations and food systems work. And it's interesting that there's a lot of feelings that they have. Some of them are based on wanting to be empowered and wanting to have power. And in part, they would like to see a more flattened system, so that there's flattened hierarchy and there's an opportunity for them to participate at every level. And while I applaud that, and I understand and applaud chaos, it doesn't take into consideration experience and the elders that can also add value, and how you integrate those two aspects of flattened hierarchies and experience and knowledge and ritual and blend them all together is the nuance of it all. I recently read Alicia Garza's book, The Purpose of Power. And what I really appreciated in a lot of her statements was being clear about how to set agendas and how to organize, how to make movements work, how to get people to be knowledgeable about how they can work together to achieve what they want. And I think that young people are very interested in changing the world that they're growing up in and what they've inherited. And I think we have to support them with giving them the movement tools and the knowledge of what is the purpose of that power and how do you deploy it.
Yeah.
I was just going to uplift the Mycelium Youth Network and Youth versus the Apocalypse. This pandemic has been horrible on so many levels, in so many ways, but one way that it was useful to us is being able to connect with other organizations like these two for our youth, to hear different voices and to hear, as you said, Rowen, the stories that kids are able to tell each other. That as an older person, we're like, there used to be cultural burn-ins for this, as opposed to having the kids talk to each other. It was really, really wonderful.
I love that. I love the upliftment of the multiple generations. It's not only cross-cultural, but it's intergenerational work that we have to do here. I mean, I think just on a hyper-local level, I up here in the Sierra Foothills, I think that something really innovative with our local tribe, the Nisenan, Shelley Covert has been doing a lot of work up here to gain visibility. For those of you who are listening in the global audience, in the United States alone, there are about 560 plus federally recognized tribes, which mean that the United States government has deemed these tribes to be an entity that has a relationship with the federal government. But there are quite a number of other tribal communities who do not have federal recognition, who also, suffered immensely under the waves of settler colonization, westward expansion in California, multiple times over, a lot of intense genocide that happened here. And there is a program up here that's called the Ancestral Homelands Reciprocity Program, which is beautiful. They go into schools, they educate folks at a hyper-local level that remind people that the indigenous peoples are still alive and they're still here and they still have that blood memory and that ancestral brilliance to share within our community. And I think that particular program, they go to businesses, and I think there's ways in which businesses can give back, as sort of a kind of a reparations type program, but it's also an educational outlet for people to get really clear. Because, now they have the apps where you can type in and figure out, whose land are you on? And then at every single conference, there's like land acknowledgements, which, I will say that, land acknowledgements are performative unless you are actively, engaging in relationships with the first peoples of that land and engaging in that reparations work. And so it's actually actively engaging in relationships, and not through saviorism. We're done with that. We're done with the era of, white people are going to come in and save the Indians. It's like, nah, like, you need us more than we need you. At this point, like, we have a lot of cultural memory and information that really is going to be the crux of whether we thrive in California or whether this whole thing just goes down in flames. And I think that we really need to remember that. And again, I've written a lot of thought pieces on my social media around just highlighting sort of the arrogance of modern day people living out of alignment with those original agreements. And I think now's the time for especially allies, people with wealth and resource, to decenter themselves, to pass the mic and the leadership to Indigenous peoples from all over the globe, and recenter this sprouting of this new culture that will bring us back into sanity. And it's a long game. A lot of this work is going to bear fruits long beyond the time of my own lifetime and the lifetimes of those here present. But we have to start working on it now. Because if we're looking at climate resilience and looking at climate chaos and actively making sane solutions on that, it actually begins with culture. It begins with growing a next generation of people who see the earth as mother, right? And who treat the earth in that relational respectful way. And what we have right now is a lot of people who are so generations removed from that understanding of their place in the world, that they're just creating so much destruction, and it's reflecting on the land and impacting people who are just trying so hard to keep little ceremonies alive and these little ways alive in these little enclaves of diversity. And so, that's the call to action here. If anybody, if as we continue, I know the next piece is to really, we all have been in circle here listening to these incredible folks. But when you leave this, whatever emotions that you feel from the stories that are being shared here, it's not just enough to come and listen and uplift your own knowledge, but what are you committing to when you leave this space? Who are you committing to uplift, empower, and resource? Is it land back? Is it resources to entities like Kelly and Leonard's organizations, and there's so many of them across the country. How are we resourcing BIPOC farming and ecological stewardship organizations to to continue to grow towards that cultural sanity again? So I would love to hear from Leonard and Kelly in terms of what are ways in which folks can support your work, or can support what is your call to action from this time? Because I think we have an urgency right now. I mean, we're not in fire season right now, but we're going to have another fire season again. And so how can people begin to start doing the slow, steady work to move us in the right direction?
Thanks, Rowen, for all of that. And as we kind of round the corner into the last, 10, 15 minutes of our conversation, building on what you said around the calls to action, also want to kind of broaden out to some of the things that we talked about before, like what is the pivot, what is the radical change that you all see that needs to happen right now, building on what we've talked about in terms of concentric land stewardship, Indigenous land management, return of education, literacy around cultural burns, et cetera. Like what else do you all see that you want to name, including the calls to action that you said, Rowen, and then wanting to bring in one of the questions that's been kind of lifted up through the chat and through the audience is, what are the ways in terms of the Latino farm worker community here in California kind of fits into the centering of communities of color, centering of the ancestral knowledge that farm workers that have been working here for decades and kind of and been on this land for hundreds and hundreds of years, kind of how do they fit into what you all see as that pivot and the radical change that needs to happen, as well as the calls to action that you might see in your work in your communities.
Great. Yeah, I wish we had somebody from that community on this panel. I think it's unfortunate that we don't. But what I will say before I pass the mic is that those people are Indigenous too, a lot, and ways in which we can uplift their leadership. They're not farm workers, they're farmers, right? And to uplift and center their brilliance, their ancestral brilliance that comes through them. And so how can we create a relational food landscape that values the contribution of those Indigenous people who are just, our country and our community owes so much to them, and they're oftentimes so, the erasure and they've been so invisibilized in the food landscape. So yeah, I agree. Ways in which we can uplift them and include them in the conversation. Leonard? Oh, you're muted.
this disenfranchisement of the farmers that you were just speaking about, the Latino farmers that have not been able to grow as much of their own culturally relevant foods and to provide food to their communities. Because our responsibility as farmers is not to grow a bunch of food and make a bunch of money. Our responsibility as farmers is to feed our communities and all of our communities. So all of the disenfranchised women and Latino and Latina farmers who've not been able to get access to land and grow those foods that they can provide to their family members. I remember years ago that a group of farmers that I was working with asked me, "Hey, Leonard, can we grow some garbanzos?" And I'd only eaten garbanzos dry. I didn't realize that what they primarily were interested in was fresh garbanzos. And so we started growing fresh garbanzos, and people would show up into our fields and they'd want to take an armful, they'd want to take a back seat full. And I just stepped back from it. And it was just an opportunity for the community to get access to something that they just weren't used to getting in our region anymore. So culturally relevant foods and letting people participate in that food system is huge. And another quick story is we have this tree that has been smoldering since the fires were put out about 2 months ago.
Wow.
And it continues to smolder, and it sometimes flames up. And it reminds me of a little volcano in Hawaii, that's constantly smoldering. But it also symbolically reminds me that these issues, these fires, these flames of passion, of anger, of hatred, of selfishness, they sit and they smolder for really long times. So it's really important that we all step in and speak truth about those and allow those issues to be aired and burn through and burn out, because if not tended, they will flare up again.
Well said.
That was well said. I guess I would say tell your children the truth, the truth, not just as you know it, but do some deep studying into what, has brought us to this point. When, I drive a truck for the farm, and one day my child called from school, from the office, begging me to just come and pick them up, walk from East Oakland to their school to pick them up, because they had this feeling that I was making climate change. I was contributing to this, the deterioration of our climate. And so it starts with young children, right? It starts with getting them in the mindset of, it's not just about you. It's not just about what you want. And as I mentioned earlier, not just what you can hold and have right this second, right? But what you need for your future, what you need to continue on, the 7-generation principle, right? Like, not just you, not just your kids, but so, on and on to make sure we're still here. I think that making sure that our kids have this idea that everything is not right, that we can't sugarcoat it for them anymore. We can't, pretend that things are okay when things are not okay. And in terms of our work, you can find out more about Acting on Verba at anvfarm.org. Again, it's A as in Apple, N as in Nancy, V as in Victor, farm, FARM.org. Thank you.
Great.
One thing I want to say before we kind of do the last few minutes of kind of continue last thoughts on this, I want to apologize for those of you who weren't here at the beginning, the very beginning. We wanted to be able to center the voices and perspectives of Rowen and Kelly and Leonard in this conversation, and let people know that we wouldn't get to all the questions that you're putting in the chat and the comments. Apologies for that if you're like have burning questions that you really wanted to get answered in this session, but wanted to really kind of go where Rowen and Kelly and Leonard kind of with their perspectives as it relates to this conversation. So apologies for that. But yeah, as we close up in the last 5 minutes, additional calls to action, radical change that you all think we need to see going forward to move in the direction of what you all have been talking about for the last hour.
Yeah, I mean, I think at the end of the day, as we all know, because we've been through layers and layers of transformative times, is that these changes are not going to be comfortable. And so we have to be willing to be in a discomfort, especially those who have historically been given a lot more power than others. It's going to be uncomfortable for you to confront the ways in which your privilege perhaps has harmed others, and ways in which you need to leverage that power and actually give that power up to other communities of culture and color. And so this isn't always going to be a comfortable process, but if we lean into that discomfort, when we come out the other side, as Leonard was using fire as sort of a metaphor, if we allow that fire to burn in that kind of way, we come out transformed as a collective, and we are all in community together, whether we like each other or not. So we're going to have to come together and lean into the places where we have common ground, and rebirth a new way of living, whether it's in California or wherever you live, rebirth a new normal, because we can't go back to the way things were. And the things that have been emerging, the mutual aid networks, are amazing. So our organization, Native American Food Sovereignty Alliance, it's nativefoodalliance.org. Please feel free to find us on social media or on our website. We're doing a lot of work to uplift and resource farmers and land stewards and wisdom keepers in our network. And so that's really the call to action, is just as much resources that you can move onward to BIPOC organizations that are renewing these original agreements, I think is key in this time. So
Leonard, Kelly, maybe last thoughts before we close up at 2 Pacific, that is. Oh, Leonard, you're on mute.
Visions are something that we all have, but over the last hundreds of years, only a few privileged numbers of us have been able to take our vision and enact them. And I think that's really the piece of the sharing and the piece of the pie that we need to share. We all have good visions. We just need an opportunity to be at the table and take leadership and put our visions forth. Not to have our visions put forward by other people, not to have our skills and our experiences used by other people, but to be able to be there at the table and put them forward ourselves. That's the sharing of power that's really essential at this moment, is that we all have to be a part of that solution.
Yeah.
Thanks for that, Leonard.
I think Rowen and Leonard really encapsulated all that I've been thinking about, all that I've been feeling. I guess my last call to action would be to use your voice for good, to, use, just because you don't have as much power or privilege doesn't mean that you don't have some power and some privilege, right? So use what you have to uplift other folks, to uplift other communities, and to uplift, all that we're seeing right now. I can't, this right now is a lot. What's happening in the US right now is a lot for me. And I wish that more people that look like these idiots would talk about it, that they would use their voice to try to calm this shit down.
Yeah. We also, I just want to I just want to close out with a question for the audience, which is that, you know, if we are in a time where Indigenous and Black and bodies of culture are in a leadership position because our blood memory knows the picture of this future that we all can envision inside of our heads, this landscape of relational nourishment and equity and community, and a community rooted in care and reciprocity. The question to you is, what are you doing today that makes that a possibility, right? Like, what is one small action that you can do that can make that a possibility? Because it doesn't have to be a giant action. It can be tiny, a lot of islands of coherence of tiny little things that come together to make that a possibility.
Thanks so much for closing with that question, Rowen. Thanks again for the conference for hosting this conversation, to the Castanea Fellowship for giving us this space, and for all of you for participating. One last plug: if you want to hear from more Castanea Fellows and more from Rowen, there is a session tomorrow on Indigenous farming and land stewardship on Turtle Island, January 13th at 7 p.m. GMT. So invite all of you to join that session as well. Thank you all so much.
Thanks.
Thank you.